Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this really important conversation that we're going to have. My name is Kim Decker. I'm the Executive Director of the YWCA here in Cambridge and one of the founding members of the Feminist Shift, which is a collaboration between YWCA Cambridge and YWKW. It was formed with the goal of eliminating gender-based violence in Waterloo Region and building capacity among feminist organizations and supporters to do this work together. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land from which I'm coming to you today as a territory traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral peoples. I also acknowledge the enduring presence of colonialism and the harm it continues to do to the first peoples of this land, and also the enduring deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. Today marks 199 days since Ontario announced a state of emergency and the province went into lockdown. It's shocking to think that it took fewer than 200 days to spark the undoing of 30 years of advancement in gender equity. That's where we're at today, and that's why we're here today. We're talking about the need for an intersectional feminist economic recovery. Our conversation today springboards off the fantastic report co-authored by YWCA Canada and the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the Rotman School of Management, a feminist economic recovery plan, making the economy work for everyone. In this report, the authors outline very concisely the impacts of this pandemic and the impact it's having currently on cis and trans women and girls and gender diverse individuals and across intersections of economic status, racialization, immigration status, ability, education, and all the other pieces that make up our identities and impact how we move in this world. I am so excited with the lineup of speakers that we have today who will be diving into what a feminist economic recovery is and what it could or should look like in Waterloo Region. Audience members, you're invited to submit your questions to the panelists through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. We are going to go through a series of questions with each of the panelists. When I ask the questions, we're going to have them answered in the same order. So Anjum and Catherine will answer, and then Elizabeth and Jeanette will answer. We want to start with a broader national focus in answers and then funnel down to what's happening here locally in the region of Waterloo. So I'd just like to take a quick opportunity to introduce the panelists to you today. So first is Anjum Sultana. Anjum is coming to us from Toronto, located on the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petum First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Anjum is the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada, the country's largest and oldest gender equity organization. The YWCA Federation has 32 member associations and works in 300 communities across Canada. Together, they reach over 330,000 people every year. Some key areas of focus for the organization include childcare, economic justice, gender-based violence, housing and homelessness. Anjum is the primary author and operations lead for a feminist economic recovery plan, making the economy work for everyone, the first nationally focused recovery plan of its kind. Anjum holds a master's in public health from the Dalla School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and she is frequently a cited expert, and her commentary has been featured on platforms such as Apolitical, CBC, CityTv, CityTv, First Policy Response, Healthy Debate, National Observer, New Canadian Media, Public Policy Forum, the Walrus, Toronto Sun and TVO. Welcome, Anjum. Catherine Scott is coming to us today from Ottawa, located on the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Catherine is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and serves as the director for its gender equality and public policy work. She has worked in the community sector as a researcher, a writer, and an advocate over the past 20 years, writing on a range of issues from social policy to inequality to funding for not-for-profits. She is passionate about research that speaks to the aspirations of communities and supports collective action for change. Welcome, Catherine. Dr. Jeanette Lafreniere is coming to us from Waterloo, located on the Haldimand Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and are within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Jeanette is the Associate Dean of MSW Programs at the Lyle S. Hallman Faculty of Social Work. She is also an Associate Professor and Director of the Social Innovation Research Group and the Manulife Center for Community Health Research. She has a master's degree in the management and development of cooperatives and worked for 10 years in the co-op movement in Ontario and Quebec in the 1990s. She is one of the founding members of 2 housing cooperatives, as well as a feminist research collective, while engaged in her doctoral studies at McGill University, where her research was focused on exploring determining factors influencing women's community organizing experiences. Dr. Lafreniere believes that community social workers and educators can play a pivotal role in advocating for the innovative strategies addressing structural inequalities and barriers to women's economic empowerment. Welcome, Jeanette. Elizabeth Clark is also coming to us from Waterloo. Elizabeth is the CEO of the KWYW and a current Kitchener councillor for the region of Waterloo. She has worked for 30 years as a social worker and social work manager and administrator, and has spent her career in the not-for-profit sector. Elizabeth has a master's degree in social work with a focus on social policy and administration, and has completed Wilfrid Laurier University's postgraduate management and leadership certificate. She also serves as the chair for the region of Waterloo's Community Services Committee. Thanks, Elizabeth. Anjum, I'm wondering if you could begin and tell us, what is the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan?
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, and it's so great to be here among friends and so many incredible people. Kim was telling me a bit about who some of the audience members are, so really glad to be here with all of you. I'm just going to share my screen so I can tell you a bit about the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan. And it's not going to be a long conversation, but I just wanted to make sure that you saw this. So like Kim mentioned, this was a partnership with the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the University of Toronto. So we did this in partnership. You know, kind of just going forward a bit in terms of some of the recommendations. So in total, we had 8 pillars and 27 recommendations. One of the recommendations was actually doing social procurement, investing in women-led businesses and businesses led by equity-seeking communities. So I would say from tip to tail, this Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, our website, our design, the report, the drafting, the copy editing, everything, it was primarily focused or done by young women. And so that's something, you know, we mentioned that as a recommendation, investing in communities, but through our report, we did that to our the best of our ability as well. So even the beautiful illustrations that some of you may have seen in the report in the website, that was all done by young women of color, which we're quite proud of. So in terms of the plan itself, so the plan in many ways is a vision for a better society, a vision that we know is possible. As anyone has seen during this crisis, we've seen things move on policy files that we haven't seen move in generations. And that's because of the urgent need to change and respond to the crisis before us. But it also shows us if we push hard enough, we can make the society we want happen and make the economy work for everyone. So this plan offers both the research evidence that is undeniable about the gendered impacts. And I want to give a shout out to Catherine Scott, a fellow panelist, who many of her research pieces of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, we cited in our report. And Catherine was also an expert reviewer, and we're so glad, along with Roz Gunn at YWCA Cambridge, among others. So really, this plan also looks at the realities on the ground. So it's 8 pillars, so you can see the pillars before you, and 27 recommendations. I think what makes our plan different are a few different things. One is that, again, it's the first nationally focused plan. So as a pan-Canadian organization, we wanted to represent that in this recovery plan for Canada. But what we also do is we unpack, what does success look like? When will we know we've actually recovered from this crisis? So oftentimes a lot of recovery conversations talk about GDP and seeing if that comes back to pre-COVID levels, for example, or if the number of jobs returns back to what it was before. And that is important and crucial. But we also talk about how important it is to look at things like homelessness. Has that decreased? Have we addressed gender-based violence? So part of what makes our plan different is the measuring success. In our plan, a key part of it is addressing systemic racism. We know that this crisis has impacted women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people the most, but within that, there's intersections. And so that's one of the things that we call for in our plan as well. And we also talk about addressing gender-based violence and hate crimes as well. We believe we can't have an economy that works for everyone in a climate of fear, violence, discrimination, and hate. And finally, within the plan, we talk a lot about what does decent work look like. So having paid sick leave, ensuring that people are paid appropriately. We also talk about investing in the care economy. And I know Catherine will probably speak to this more, but we've seen the economy can't restart without childcare and investing in the workers that make that possible. So these are some of the aspects of our plan, but to read it in further depth, you can go to our website at www.feministrecovery.ca. But ultimately, what we wanted to make clear and what we saw in the throne speech last week is that we need a feminist recovery, we need an intersectional recovery, and we've seen the government actually take up this language. So the next part of the puzzle is making sure they follow through on their commitments. So I'll stop here, but really it's grounded in the work that YWCAs do across the country, but also what we see as necessary to create that more inclusive society and economy.
Thanks,
so I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thanks, Anjum, very much. So we are going to go to the panel now with the first question. And Catherine, I'm going to ask you to address the question first. And it's, what does a feminist recovery look like to you? And why do we need it?
Thanks so much, Kim, and thanks to everyone, Anjum in particular, for those kind words off the top. And it's certainly been a tremendous pleasure for me working with all of the different National Women's Org, and of course the YWCA plays such an incredibly important role across the country and in the communities, you know, so it's a tremendous pleasure to be working and a great opportunity to have a chance, because usually I'm, you know, talking about federal policies and the like, but it, you know, really it's what's happening on the ground, and this opportunity to make the connection to local community is really important. So I'm excited about this opportunity and event and pleased to be here. Shout out certainly to everyone there. I was just mentioning my daughter's just started at University of Waterloo, so, and well, she's in Ottawa, but theoretically starting from at the University of Waterloo in spirit in any event. So I kind of was excited to take this opportunity up. Yes, so what does a feminist recovery look like? My organization, I'm the national office, but we've been tracking, there's an Ontario office as well, my colleagues in Toronto, we've been tracking sort of rapid response on the, you know, the unfolding of the pandemic and the lockdown for the last 7 months. And I've been focusing in particular on the impacts on women and sort of the unfolding crisis in the Canada's care economy. Certainly, I think we can all agree that the pandemic exposed the systemic undervaluing of paid and unpaid work in the economy, which is obviously reflected most graphically in the appalling working conditions of care providers, the concentration, for instance, of rates of infection in neighborhoods where, you know, where a large number of frontline or precarious workers reside, certainly the data out of Toronto most recently, as well as the conditions certainly among migrant care workers and migrant agricultural workers. So I mean, really this pandemic has revealed the underlying fault lines that were always pre-existing in our communities. I've been struck by the reluctance of government, certainly on the care file, the reluctance of governments to act in the face of desperate need, expecting households and women in particular to shoulder what has been a massive increase in unpaid labor. Certainly as we go through this fall with the unfolding school transition to school, we see that playing out in real time. And I think in the absence, and this sort of coming back to your question, in the absence of a feminist recovery plan, what we're seeing, and certainly the absence of significant investment in care and education, what we're seeing is that women and mothers in particular are dropping out of the labor market or scaling back their involvement tremendously. And certainly my recent research is looking, or I've been following some of these data on this score. For instance, lone parents are being significantly impacted in communities across the country. They have recouped a fraction of their employment losses that were that they experienced this spring, and many are still working less than 50% of the hours that they had been working. That's fully 1 in 3 are in this situation, lone parents, and with lone parents with kids under 6, it's 42%. So significant challenges facing lone parents. And this is a particular issue I know in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. I sort of pulled up the data for your community, and I mean, I don't think it's the myth, but rates, Kitchener-Waterloo going into the crisis had sort of middle of the pack levels of employment among women, and women in your region have suffered a particularly significant loss of employment, and they haven't been coming back to the rate. It's quite distinct when it's compared to the Canadian rate. Even the recovery we've experienced to date, Kitchener-Waterloo, women in Kitchener-Waterloo are lagging the national average on the recovery. So it speaks to how this type of crisis plays out in a local level. So yes, I'll speak a bit more about what a feminist recovery, but it's essential. We need to very meaningfully and purposefully center the experiences of women, diverse women, in our recovery efforts.
Thanks, Catherine. Anjum, I'll pass it over to you.
Sorry, me? Okay, great. So I think Catherine really covered and I think, Catherine, thank you so much for talking about the Kitchener-Waterloo area and doing that deep dive, because I think it also brings into context. I think the reason why feminist recovery is so central, I think what people don't realize is that this recession is different. In the history of Canada, we've never had a recession quite like this that has impacted women workers at such an enormous scale. Previous recessions, it has impacted women workers, but it has impacted perhaps sectors that were more comprised of men in those particular professions or roles or sectors. But the sectors that have been most impacted, retail, food services, tourism, hospitality, primarily women workers. And we also don't know, and Catherine spoke about this, we don't know how those jobs are going to come back, if at all. Tourism is going to look very different in a post-COVID world, hospitality, retail, food. So I think part of it also is just really meeting this moment where this is the reality. And so the previous playbook of how we address recessions and how we just address other impacts of a pandemic, we can't use the same playbook. And that's why feminist recovery is so important. And so when we saw, personally, when I saw in the throne speech, a recognition of that we need a feminist recovery, that we need an intersectional recovery, that is what they were pointing to, that this recession is different. So we need to act differently. I think part of it is also not just using the same old models of job recovery where it's just about jobs or just about GDP, but realizing people live holistic lives. So we need to invest in all of the things that matter to them, including care. And I think that's what makes a feminist recovery different and necessary. It's not just about one domain of your life, it's the entire, what you bring to the table. So I'll leave it there for now and expand further, but really we need a feminist recovery because our country has never experienced something like this before. So we need a new playbook, and that's what our plan offers.
Thanks, Anjum. Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you. You're muted, sorry. There we go.
Thank you. Well, Catherine already sort of alluded to it. I'm here to talk about Waterloo Region in particular, and I think we can get a little complacent here and we think of ourselves as a pretty healthy space to be in economically, and overall that may be the case, but we're not all doing as well. Prior to COVID, women in Waterloo Region were already underrepresented in the workforce. We had 66% women engaged in paid work as opposed to 74% for men. And women were more than 3 times more likely than men to work part-time, and that's very significant. That contributed to the fact that the median income gap between men and women was almost $14,000. And one of the main reasons for these inequities was women's greater burden of caregiving and other domestic labor. So during the COVID-related closures, women in Waterloo Region were more likely than men to have lost their jobs or to have their hours of work reduced. And now, as Catherine mentioned, with reopened schools and childcare centers, it's women much more than men who are finding their work lives disrupted by the need to keep sick and isolating kids at home. So for me, locally, a feminist recovery isn't just returning to pre-COVID conditions, but building back better for women with a post-COVID Waterloo region where women are supported to be as engaged in the workforce as men, with the same opportunities as men, and ultimately earning the same incomes as men. And you know, part of the question was, why do we need it? And I think, you know, we need this not just for women who are more likely now than men to live in poverty, and not just for their families, but we need women working and earning to their greatest potential for the economy as a whole to recover.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jeanette, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to preface my statement by welcoming my students to this forum, and thank you to the organizers who thought I had something legitimate to add to this conversation. That'll be up to you folks to judge. So I'd like to start by troubling or disrupting the notion of recovery. To this end, as a community social worker and educator, I'm inspired by critical mental health literature that has guided the work on what recovery means or is. When we explore the term recovery, there's the idea we're going back to a construct of normal. But what we need to question is who gets to construct what is normal. The definition of recovery is pretty clear: the action or process of regaining possession or control of something stolen or lost, the return to a normal state. With regards to our economic climate prior to the pandemic, the economic climate in which we find ourselves was not in any way normal. And as my colleagues have aptly pointed out, the pandemic has shone a bright light on the warts of capitalism in our society. So having said this, I will most respectfully reject the notion of recovery, because I think as feminists, we deserve more. I propose a feminist transformation plan, which at its core revolutionizes the way in which we work and produce goods in a consumer-driven society. I am inspired by the work already undertaken in Hawaii, whereby organizers have introduced statewide legislation that hopefully will influence feminist advocacy efforts in coronavirus response policies worldwide. Entitled Building Bridges, Not Walking on Backs, this plan includes special emergency funds for marginalized groups, universal childcare, universal basic income, as well as a $24.80 per hour minimum wage set to the needs of single moms. In my mind, and in answer to the question, I believe that we can be more ambitious than the Hawaii model. In my opinion, what is needed in order to redress and address a transformational recovery, so to speak, is a community organizing initiative on an international level. And I will illustrate what that might look like as a start locally in my following answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeanette, very much. As the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan for Canada points out, 56% of women workers are concentrated in occupations known as the 5 Cs: caring, cashiering, catering, cleaning, and clerical functions. The vast majority of job losses since the start of the pandemic has been in these sectors, and this rings true for Waterloo Region as well. Certainly for us at YWCA Cambridge, and Elizabeth and I were just chatting very briefly beforehand at YWKW as well, childcare is certainly at the top of the list for concern for us in both of our organizations and in the community as a whole. So your question, or the question to the panelists, is how can a feminist economic recovery address feminist issues such as undervalued care work, systemic racism, a lack of diverse voices and decisions, the childcare crisis, and gender-based violence? Catherine, I'll ask you to answer first.
Thanks, Kim. Completely agree with Jeanette. Certainly we're looking for, certainly not looking to get back to normal. We're looking to reset normal is some of the language. We're looking build back better, transformative. The Hawaii plan is very inspirational. Could you imagine actually setting using a lone parent as a benchmark for income security programming, which would be extraordinary, and really turn our systems on their heads? I think that's a really interesting thought, and was, as I said, very inspired by the Hawaii example and others around the world. I mean, has been an amazing amazing time to see mobilization, global mobilization, including through the Ys and the like, and people coming together to put forward what's important to them. As I sort of prefaced my remarks, certainly the implosion of the care economy in Canada has been startling. I think certainly most graphically this past spring with the implosion of our long-term care sector and the hundreds of deaths, if not thousands of deaths that we've experienced in Canada related directly to the quality of care on offer, deaths that were wholly foreseeable. We're living right now through what could be, well, the collapse of our childcare sector. Our center, the CCPA, does a national survey every year of every childcare center and nurse and home-based care across the country, primarily on fees. This year, of course, we're asking about whether you're open at all, and the numbers coming back, or certainly the answers coming back, are catastrophic. We're looking certainly at upwards of half the sector perhaps not opening again or being able to stay. The centers that are open are having trouble attracting children. Parents are fearful of sending their kids. And without monies to stabilize the sector, we're at huge risk of losing. So childcare is fundamental to the recovery. Our Armin Yalnizyan, who's you must all have seen, she's been everywhere, making the case that obviously it's a she session and there's no recovery without childcare, and that's certainly true. So childcare advocates across the country have mobilized. They have a plan that they're putting forward that calls for immediate funding flowing to stabilize the sector, and then a second phase where we be actually seriously building out, finally, after 50 years after the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, we finally actually undertake to build a universal care, childcare system for all. I guess what I would say is that the speech of the throne certainly identifies childcare as a key commitment. The current government has said that they will put significant monies into building a Canada-wide system. We're not sure what that looks like. The initial investment from the Safe Start program this August was a quarter of what advocates were calling for. And of course, there's the trouble that it plagues our federation is that money on the table federally. What does that look like provincially, locally? This money has not been tied. We have no sense here in Ontario where any of those monies, where they're going. No confidence that there's huge pressure, for instance, to increase child benefits with the child care money, such that parents could direct it to whatever form of private market, public co-op care, which in the face of the collapse of the child care sector, where there's no service to buy, is completely counterintuitive. So yes, childcare is critical to build out our social infrastructure, and I would argue tied money, certainly from the federal government, is necessary to actually build high quality service, flexible services that all can use to support women's continued re-entry and continued participation in the labor market.
Thanks, Catherine. Anjum.
Yeah, so I'm so glad Jeanette mentioned the Hawaii plan. So the Hawaii plan was very, very crucial and the inspiration for YWCA Canada's national plan for feminist recovery for Canada. And for us, in many ways, this was a starting point, and thinking about what could an economy look like if we actually centered the people who have been most impacted by this pandemic, but also transforming. So I absolutely agree with the comments raised by Jeanette, and Catherine also mentioned about the childcare piece. So I think one of the things that this feminist recovery plan conversation, just like what we need to build back better, or what we need to transform our society, is we need different people at the decision-making table. So globally, there's only 23% of recovery task force in countries around the world have women at the table, only 23%. And depending on the country, it will look different. But that's something we have been fighting for. We need to see gender balance. We need to see gender diversity in all of these key decision-making tables around COVID and other key task force, because then we will get different solutions and different results. I think part of the reason why the society we have right now is not working for us is because the people in decision-making do not represent or do not embody the diversity of our country on so many different factors, including gender. So that's one of the big things that we call for and we need to see after this, as we move forward. So one of the things in the throne speech that they put forward is an action plan on women in the economy, and they use the term a diverse workforce to guide its implementation. So for us, in that task force, we need to see the full range of Canada represented. So diverse women and gender diverse people in all of their intersectional diversity. But what we also need is we need to ensure that the people who are supporting, for example, low-income people, they are at that task force. We don't want this to be necessarily a recovery that just works for people who are already doing okay. We need it to center the people who have been most disrupted and marginalized by this pandemic. So that's something we really have been pushing the government. Whenever you're developing this task force, make sure you have civil society there and the people who have been most impacted. Catherine talked a bit about the childcare element and how that has been essentially reducing women's labor market participation to numbers we haven't seen since the 1980s. So we've rolled back nearly 3 decades of work. The other aspect of this that we can't ignore is that many of the jobs that have been lost, the sectors, they will not come back. So we need to invest in the sectors that have been here and will continue to move forward. So for us, you know, the government has put forward this ambitious plan, 1 million jobs. Okay, we need to see a carve out of those jobs in the care economy. And we also need to reskill people for the different sectors that will be booming after this pandemic has subsided. And so going back to Catherine, she raised Armin Yelnazine, who was also an expert reviewer on our plan. We need not only investments in keeping the childcare spots we have, we need to expand it, but we also need quality. Quality means for the childcare center itself, but also for the workers, paying them decent wages for the incredible service that they provide. So that's part of what we also demand and call for. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anjum. Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. So while women as a group weren't doing as well economically as men were prior to COVID and have suffered more than men from the impacts of COVID, Black, Indigenous, and women of color haven't done as well and have suffered more than white women. According to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, racialized women earned only 59 cents for every dollar earned by non-racialized men prior to COVID. Black, Indigenous, and women of color are overrepresented in frontline healthcare positions that put them at greater risk of contracting COVID. They're overrepresented in the hardest hit sectors, including the hospitality sector, as Kim mentioned, and they've been disproportionately affected by job loss. A feminist recovery, in order to address those issues, I think needs to disaggregate and focus on race-based data and ensure that Black, Indigenous, and women of color are participants and leaders in recovery planning. I think that it will need to prioritize investment in the worst affected women and girls, which will include increasing wages and benefits for undervalued care work on a permanent basis. We've had some temporary announcements now a couple times. And it'll expand social safety nets, including social assistance. Childcare has been discussed and I think really needs to continue to be discussed. And I'm going to add affordable housing, I think, as really a critical piece of the recovery. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Jeanette.
Thank you. I would invert the question and ask it this way. How can feminist issues inform a feminist economic transformation? I think that that's where we want to be. We don't want to be on the other end. And my answer is it's only through strategic, thoughtful, inclusive, and intersectional community organizing that we can presume to offer an alternative to citizens and political decision makers locally, nationally, and internationally. So with regards to the question that is asked of us, locally, I have a couple of ideas, and none of them are super innovative, and they've been tried and true in the past, believe me. But I think it's important to get people around a table, so we can start by initiating a community-wide reimagining the economy roundtable with ambassadors from unions, health and social services, universities and college, faith organizations, student associations, public and private sector businesses, poverty advocacy groups, and other groups committed to transformational work. From then, we can then organize a region-wide conference on reimagining a different type of economy, which is meaningful to us. After that, after learning from that exercise, we could develop a 5-year strategy and enhance the ways we wish to sustain our enthusiasm and affection and commitment to this type of work. And on this note, if we're ambitious, we could take our cues from the Quebec Women's Federation. I was doing my PhD at McGill in 2000 and 2001 on while the Quebec Women's Federation was organizing the World March Against Poverty and Violence. And I think that it is not within the realm of the impossible that we can get together locally, nationally, internationally to make it a global movement. You have to start somewhere. Why not start in the Waterloo region? For the long term, and this to me is the most important point for me, I think it's imperative that we revisit how we teach economics and business in primary, secondary schools and university environments. If you wish to dismantle an oppressive economic system, then you have to offer an alternative. We must enter school systems and offer alternatives which are palatable. We need to infuse courses with material on the social economy, and other subject matters which humanize economics and a vision of business. And finally, and with all due respect to well-intentioned social work and social service providers, many of whom I have trained in my career, so the irony in my statement is not lost on me here. I believe that we can do more than simply help poor people cope with being poor. We need a revolution, no matter how polite we wish for that revolution to be. Otherwise, in 20 years from now, we will be sitting around the same kind of panel, hopefully in person, talking about the same issues. And I remember 25 years ago when Monsieur Ray was in power, I was part of an organization called GEO, Grassroots Economic Opportunities Development and Evaluation. And we were talking about the very same things we're talking about today. There was a political will back then in order to be able to talk about such things. And therein lies a major complicating factor in economic recovery, the political system. The shelf life of a politician is very, very short, maybe 4 years before an election. As such, our political leadership is not interested in long-term articulations of what could be 25, 50, or 100 years from now. We as an electorate must demand more vision and long-term sustainable policies in order to honor our desired recovery. COVID certainly has demanded better government, and I would say for the most part, although perhaps Catherine and others might disagree, but I would say for the most part, they have met that challenge under duress, which suggests to me that transformative change is possible and it need not take 50 or 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Being in the not-for-profit service delivery world, we at YWCA Cambridge and YWKW constantly face the struggle of lacking capacity to do the critical work of advocacy, putting on pressure and keeping it there to make change happen at any level of government. Some of you may know that in 2019, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives report, The Best and Worst Places to be a Woman in Canada, ranked Waterloo Region dead last in all of Canada for women's safety. It's extremely important as feminist organizations, we advocate for systemic change to improve this abysmal rating. The Feminist Shift came from a desire to combine voices to build capacity among feminist organizations so that together we could amplify issues affecting cis and trans women and girls, non-binary and two-spirit individuals, and ensure that we're heard across the community and in the policymaking world. Are there any community initiatives, knowledge builders, or movements that you see that are already doing pieces of this work that bring you inspiration? Catherine, I'll pass it to you first.
Thank you. I'm always, having written that report, I actually remember being quite taken aback by the information and the data on Waterloo about the challenge. That, of course, was reported. A level of violence to the police and sexual assault and intimate partner violence and the like, and then those particularly high numbers. Then we haven't had more recent data. I can't report back to you on what it is currently because all of that's delayed at StatsCan. But the level up clearly of violence that has been certainly pre-pandemic and moving in, and now within this heightened, intense period of the pandemic, it's much heightened. And I know that you have, if you're looking for local inspiration, obviously the shelters, sexual assault centers, the community work that's going on through the Y and other organizations has been extraordinary to meet incredibly heightened demand, scrambling, and there with modest support. There was an initial investment that assisted from the federal government that flowed down to assist with the purchase of goods and like sanitizer and the like and helping to space, but certainly it wasn't going to be able to meet the scale of the need. And certainly we were talking about local inspiration as well. in conjunction with what was been going on, obviously, in the gender-based violence movement, violence against women and gender diverse people, certainly the Black Lives Matter and the move to, obviously the explosion of the social movement around to defund the police and to rethink community safety is critically important in this context. And I take, you're looking at inspiration. I think that the seeds of change are there, and there's huge mobilization that's happening in the community, and that's really where change will come from. I mean, we can talk about what's going on nationally, but really it does come from the bottom up, and I think we are starting to see change. Certainly there were there is a promise from the federal government to move forward on a national action plan for violence against women and gender-based violence, as well as critically the calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women. Those are on the agenda, as well as their promise to address systemic racism against racialized communities as well as Indigenous peoples through reform to the justice system. I'm not sure reform really is what's called for, whether as opposed to blowing up the justice system and reassembling the pieces. But yes, I think there's a tremendous energy now, and the question is, how do we channel and mobilize that to make lasting transformative change?
Thank you, Catherine. Anjum.
Yeah, I've just been inspired by the incredible pan-Canadian movement for feminist recovery and folks that have been working on gender-based violence, folks that have been working around childcare and economic justice. I think across the country, we've seen a narrative in the media that we typically don't see. We've actually seen people talk about the fact that this is a new recession. It is a she-cession, as Armin Yilmazine has said. But really, the gendered impacts of this crisis and how it's impacted cis and trans women, two-spirited people, and also gender diverse people. I've been doing a lot of reading of Canadian media and American media, and I will say this conversation is not getting as much play in the American discourse. So I think that really speaks to the power of people across this land that have been pushing this conversation to the forefront through media, through advocacy, through campaigning. So I think just the general movement has been critical. I also want to do a shout out and just incredibly honored by the work that, and humbled by the work of Jocelyn Forsma, the Executive Director of the National Association of Friendship Centers. Throughout this crisis, their organization has been just continuing to deliver essential services and also pushing for that systemic change. And she was on a panel recently, and it was through, I can't remember the exact organization that organized it. There's so many Zooms these days, but she was talking about, a lot of times there's this conversation around building back better, and a lot of times the ways in which that Indigenous communities have been pushing forward their Indigenous focused community services, we can learn a lot from. So she was talking a lot about housing and shelter services, and talking about when people are not able to pay rent, thinking about different ways of how we can build community and thinking about how we can support people in their housing security that is not in this punitive format. And I think also Catherine spoke a lot about Black Lives Matter and the movements around defunding police and just rethinking community safety. I think we need to really think about the recommendations that have been put forward in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that have been put forward in the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit People, because many of the solutions that would help us withstand this pandemic or withstand the current crisis that we're in, communities have been talking about for decades, if not centuries, but the political will, for whatever reason, and the systemic racism that has stopped that from happening has robbed all of us from the type of society we can and should be having. So I think those are some of the places that I draw inspiration from. And I also want to say a fantastic organization that has been doing a lot of this critical consciousness raising has been Future Ancestor Services. It's led by Larissa Crawford, and it is an Indigenous-owned and Black-owned social enterprise that does a lot of anti-racism training, a lot of organizational development, but also thinking about how we can transform organizations at small, medium, and large scales to create the society that we want. So if you haven't seen the great work of Larissa and Future Ancestor Services, do check it out. I think even in the name, that conversation around ancestors thinking about how our actions impact not only the generations right after us, but for 7 generations to come. I think those types of teachings, that's something we all need to be thinking about as we think about the next stage post-COVID. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Anjum. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Kim. Inspiration is probably too strong a word, but there are a couple of things happening locally that give me some hope and even some confidence. Our council, Waterloo Region's council, is in the process of creating a 2 to 3 year economic recovery framework. And I know that investments in affordable housing are going to be a very significant part of that framework. We haven't talked as much yet about childcare, but I do hope and believe that we'll see that emphasized as well. At the same time as we're doing that work, we've created an anti-racism advisory committee, which will begin its work later this month, I understand, and its role is to provide information and advice and recommendations to council. So I think we can and we need to bring these 2 initiatives together in a way that centers women, and particularly Black, Indigenous, and women of color in our economic recovery. And I think that we need to prioritize for the services and supports that we deliver as a region, neighborhoods where women's income is lowest, where there are fewer women in the workplace, and with a higher populations of racialized individuals and families.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jeanette.
Okay, in terms of inspiration, I would say that I am inspired by my students who hold me and my colleagues accountable every single day. So if I could see my students, which I cannot, but I'm sure my students would probably say things like, how would you define a feminist recovery? What is the place of gender diversity within this conversation? How inclusive is our conversation of trans allies? And so when we're trying to build something and reconceptualize a recovery, I think those are very legitimate elements for us to be able to debate. I think there are individuals in Waterloo Region who are doing exceptional work in the community, but I think that sometimes we are all islands, but in a common sea. So what I was proposing earlier in terms of having a kind of a roundtable of opening up networks and channels of discussion, I think are really important. I think that I think the YWCA, quite frankly, through the In Her Shoes project is a tiny little example of innovation in terms of entrepreneurship and paying attention to the concept of intersectionality and self-employment. I think the tech sector, I've read a few things online with regards to being innovative and reaching out to women who are perhaps marginalized in that sector sometimes, depending on where they are in the echelon of economic where they are economically. The Working Center clearly, definitely is innovative in some of the work that they're doing. I think there are also some public intellectuals, some professors from Conestoga College, as well as Laurier and UW that are doing things and innovative things with their students. But I mean, I think that that's not enough. And if we want feminism or feminisms, how do we define feminisms? I think that if that is a framework, I think we need to be able to be very reflexive on what that means and how does that inform a recovery that is meaningful to all stakeholders and within the context of what Anjum and Madame Scott were referring to earlier with regards to that intersectional piece, which I think is really important. So that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. The status quo of public opinion can be described as a lot of things. It certainly isn't intersectional, it certainly isn't feminist, and it certainly largely doesn't support progressive programs that take public investments. So our question is, how do we generate the political will for this shift? And Catherine, I'll pass it to you first.
It's the age-old question. I mean, we've been talking about, the tenor of the conversation is that, the scope of what's needed certainly has been evident for many long years. It's, the crisis has thrown everything into sharp relief, but obviously inequality had been rising in our country for many long years, and these huge gaps as they impact communities, marginalized communities in particular, are evident. So where do we look for inspiration and how do we push it forward? I mean, this is a window, and certainly I work at an organization that generates community-based research and work on public policy issues. And, you know, I guess I can say in real time that engagement with community and doing this kind of work does propel change. Like, and I'll point to, there's two things I'd like to say. One is, recently, for instance, in the speech from the throne, we saw a change in negotiation. We're obviously in a minority parliament where the NDP were able to push to raise the income floor on the new suite, on the new EI reform, the temporary EI plans, as well as the new suite of post-serve benefits from 400 to 500. And that was partly the direct result of research that my organization did around how many people were being left behind and would have actually experienced a significant drop in income under the new measures going forward through the fall. I don't say that I say that to say that being present, engaged, and pushing forward alternatives in the moment, in this moment, can be very effective in moving change forward, and certainly as we remain in a minority situation. You know, whether how that translates into change at the community level and the provinces, I do think communities are stepping forward and putting alternatives forward, and it's fluid, and, you know, it can be impactful. I think in particular about the movement or the power that's building behind, you know, reform of disability benefits. Like, people with disabilities in this country are among the poorest, if not the poorest community. It touches huge, like 1 in 4 women reported disability of some kind. So the new promise, for instance, federally in the speech from the throne for a new disability inclusion plan is something that holds out hope, and it was really a win for the disability community that pushed really hard to say, why have we been left behind? And they were like, you know, they got the $600 benefit right at the end, like, why have we been left behind? So this is a moment that I think that, you know, is a win for that community and behooves all of us to get in behind to push forward really meaningful change for people. Sorry, that's a bit, I mean, I do think there's some opportunity right now to move forward with progressive alternatives if we mobilize as a community with the research and the advocacy behind it in initiatives such as the Y has done to push key measures, key foundational reforms forward, such as a new Canadian disability benefit. That would be transformative in the lives of millions of Canadians. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Catherine. Anjum.
I think this is a great question because, you know, it's great to see words on a page, but how does that actually change people's everyday life? How does that make a marked effect on people's quality of life? I think people have seen during this crisis, I think it's just internalized in a lot of ways, like how we're all interconnected, one, how crucial it is to have public investments to keep us safe and secure. There's been a lot of life lessons that I think people who perhaps intellectually or, you know, kind of knew, but in a way people were really feeling it on a visceral level. So I think that's where we will see and have seen incredible political will. I think Catherine is absolutely right. There is a political window here, but it will close. There will be pushes around austerity measures. There will be pushes to say, we've already spent so much money, how can we spend more? But we need to resist that. And I think part of what needs to happen is we need to have more connections between people that work at different orders of government and people who work at different aspects of society. So we have people, YWCA is a great expert in this, who are delivering services in community and working in partnership in community. And we also need connections with people that are doing work in university environments or in research and policy. We need to see everyone talking and connecting with each other, because we can't have the vision for a better society without all of us doing our part in alignment. So I think the key thing is indicating to people how if you move in this direction, there will be actually a difference in people's quality of life. I think people saw that with CERB. You know, there were so many challenges with it, but people saw on a visceral level like what that meant to actually have public investment in ensuring that you were able to withstand this crisis. And people, I think, then realize, okay, why is it that we have this, but we don't have other things to keep us in a good spot during this pandemic and other dire situations? I think you know, I'll say I've been really inspired by the work of the YWCA movement across the country in Waterloo Region, convening this conversation, but also the work that has been happening before and after. We're also seeing people take these conversations around a just recovery, a feminist recovery, an equitable recovery, and think about how does that break down in your local community. So for example, I know colleagues in Vancouver are thinking about what does feminist recovery look like. There's a huge tourism industry that is going to be completely disrupted by this crisis. What can help to you know, adjust that gap? So I think the key message I want to put out is we need connections between people who do research, policy, and service delivery. And I think that's where we'll see a better economy for us. I think Jeanette put it beautifully where she talked about the different stakeholders that need to come together. So I think that's one of the ways we can build that political will. And finally, I'll say media advocacy. Getting this in the media will drive political change, because politicians care about getting reelected. So I think part of it is putting on that public pressure, and media is a way to do it as well.
Thanks, Anjum. And Catherine, I think when I was listening to you on another panel earlier this week, one of the comments that you had made is, I think it was you, that you said that we've lost the moment without accountability.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing to remember in this discussion as well. Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Kim. I think, as Anjum suggested, the question isn't just how we generate political will, but how we maintain it. And I think we're already getting pretty exhausted. I think we need to be alert for that exhaustion and prepared to combat that. I'm encouraged to know that there are quite a few politicians and senior bureaucrats participating today. I think that that's a very good sign. As we've discussed, COVID's affected all of us, but it hasn't affected all of us equally. Its most harmful impacts have fallen disproportionately on the most vulnerable of our citizens. That's people living in poverty, the working poor, women and children, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. I think if there's a bright side to COVID, it's that it's made us pay new attention to some of these pre-existing and now worsened inequities in our society. And it's given us the opportunity, with some unprecedented investments of new resources from all levels of government, to make some real progress in addressing those inequities. But we have to target the investments where they're needed most. And I think that Anjum's probably seen pushback on the release of the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan. I saw some pushback on this event today. We know that there will always be people who object to that targeted approach and who feel that any benefit provided to others is a benefit taken away from them. But we need to tell decision makers that that's not how the economy works. The economy is only as strong as its weakest link, and it's not how social justice works.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jeanette.
Generating political will depends on many factors. And I think because we're in a volatile environment, I think it's time to bust out and just take these incredible risks, because the climate, because it's so chaotic, lends itself to that. Many of you will know that I worked a long time in the co-op movement before I joined the ranks of academe, and I believe in the cooperative model of economic development. The co-op movement is national in Canada, and its scope is actually international. And so I believe that there is room to develop new alliances between the co-op movement, women's organizations, municipalities across Canada, health, social services, poverty and disability advocacy groups, everybody that we've been talking about today. I would also submit to you, as an ambassador of the university system, that there is a role for public intellectuals to play in this conversation, and more than just a one-off of doing research. There are 96 universities in Canada in 96 different communities. Imagine what leadership, what resources, what networks we can harness in order to be able to contribute not only to the conversation, but also transformative recovery of our economy in multiple ways. Just as an aside, one of my dreams one day is to have all of the universities across Canada at the same time, at the same weekend, host a garage sale. And each garage sale would elicit, I don't know, maybe $2,000, $3,000 times 96 universities. And those monies would be generated into a community loan fund in order to help women and children who are somehow marginalized. And it wouldn't be such a difficult thing to do. What we need are people who are creative, who are systems thinkers, who are just regular folks who want a better life. And I think that that's possible within a feminist framework of being able to have dialogue, open and honest dialogue, and authentic dialogue with one another through dialogue, education, pilot projects, innovative community loan funds, resurrecting a national cooperative housing strategy, a national childcare strategy, national basic income, and pharmacare. I believe that what we have explored today might be possible. That's all.
Thanks, Jeanette, very much. Those are the last of our formal questions for the panelists, but before we open it up to questions from the audience, what I'd like to do is to give each of the panelists a couple of minutes to make some concluding remarks before we move on to the questions. So, Catherine, I'll go to you first.
Thank you. It's a great discussion. I just constantly, after everybody speaks, you're sort of thinking about this. I'm taken up with what Elizabeth and Jeanette just said, certainly around obviously the moment that we're in and what communities are doing and the opportunity that certainly our current advocates in the cooperative movement have to offer. And it does feel like this volatile moment. I think about affordable housing and what cities across the country did to house people, like certainly that was true here in Ottawa, to house people who were living on the street in temporary hotels, and the buying up assets so that would that communities were able to pivot on a dime and actually really make a substantive dent into homelessness in Canada by providing for ensuring that people have a place to live. Like, this is the moment where maybe we can actually move that forward and in a transformative way. I guess the two things that come to me when I think this sort of summarize, I think both that sort of the idea of the universal and the local in terms of a transformative response to this pandemic. I'm struck, and I do social policy, national, the strength of the foundational pieces. This really, for me, is an opportunity. The gaping holes in our income security system, largely for people of working age who were not, when it hit, our employment insurance was wholly inadequate to the magnitude of the crisis that was upon Canada, and what happened with the rollout of the, CERB and the wage subsidy systems, and where we are now in trying to create, having discussions around basic income and what a minimum income guarantee might look like, the disability benefit that I just mentioned. I think that's so critical as we look at what's necessary for community prosperity, people's health and well-being. How strong are our foundations? How strong is the social infrastructure in our community? And that's not just roads and sewers and all the rest. It's our social infrastructure. It's employment or caring services and the like. And at the same time, how do we create really highly tailored, we collectively support and create highly tailored responses to those who are most marginalized? Because we know we need that strong foundation, but we know that there are specific unique needs, and the Indigenous community is leading the way in carving out what's necessary for self-government and reconciliation, again within that context of strong foundation. So this is a challenge that's calling us to step forward and to listen, and to really listen hard, and to get behind change for the most marginalized. And I think we can do that by fighting hard for universal, comprehensive supports for everyone, and then zeroing in on what's needed, certainly at the local and community level, to facilitate, healthier, greater prosperity for those communities going forward. So that's my thought about the universal and the need for the two strategies going forward.
Thanks, Catherine. Anjum, your concluding remarks.
Thank you. This has been such a rich conversation, so thank you again for convening this. I've learned a lot. I've taken a lot of notes. I think for me, I think about what has been keeping us safe during this crisis and healthy. And, you know, we've seen how the health of our society is interlinked with the health of our economy. So we really need to invest in the things that keep us healthy, well, and safe. So I think about the social determinants of health. So Elizabeth talked about housing. You know, we've talked about in our plan clean water. We talked about income security, decent working conditions, but also care. Care has been keeping us going. So I think in terms of what we need to do moving forward, there is our roadmap. What has kept us safe during this crisis? That's where we need to invest our money and dollars and attention. But even from this conversation, I think we need to also try different things, like what Jeanette has been saying, like some of the recommendations she has put forward. I think we can only have that through dialogue, through conversation. I think, you know, people across the country have been having different types of Zoom calls since this pandemic has started. So I think there has been horrific devastation of life loss and economic disparities and social freefall that has happened because of this pandemic. But in some ways, it has created opportunities for us to connect in ways we have never done before. Are we taking full advantage of that? And I think, you know, there's a great group called Color of Poverty, Color of Change. Their plan that they put forward, they call it a reconstruction plan, so similar to the language that Jeanette has been using. But I think for us to have reconstruction or transformation or recovery, we need different people making decisions and putting forward solutions. So I would like to see how we can actually, you know, everyone here, you have an idea of how we can make our society work better or our economy work better for everyone. I think now is the time to put forward your ideas. Government is listening in a way I haven't seen before in terms of the work that I've been doing. So I think they also want ideas at the table. So it's up to us to also push that forward. So I'd say, yeah, like we need to center new voices. And that's part of what this moment offers us. And there's truly no excuse. Anyone can, you know, we don't necessarily have the physical limitations of going to a particular part of the country to have a particular meeting with someone. Now we can do it if people have access to a safe and secure internet line. We can do it in a much easier way. So I think we need to start to think about how we create solutions differently. And I think that's what I'm moving away from this event in particular. So thank you again. And I look forward to more conversations. I hope this is not the end, because I think that's what we need. We need continuous dialogue to push the needle forward.
Thanks, Anjum, very much. Elizabeth.
Just very briefly, in closing, I want to emphasize the interconnections between economic policy and social justice. We can't measure a healthy economy by the wealth of its most privileged citizens, and we can't meaningfully measure it by its citizens' average wealth. We have to measure a healthy economy by the extent to which all its citizens have equal access to wealth. And we know that in our country and in our community, women, and particularly trans women, Black, Indigenous, and women of color, women with disabilities, don't have equal access to wealth. And we need to be focusing on fixing that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jeanette.
I was thinking, on March 26th, I went shopping for the first time after 10 days of being at home, probably curled up in a fetal position on my couch because I couldn't grasp what was taking place in terms of how I had to pivot so quickly from one workplace and doing things in another way. And so I landed up in the grocery store, and because there was such a long lineup, I was way in the back where the frozen food section was, and there was a lady in front of me, and she was on the phone with her presumably partner, and she was teary because the partner had to work and she was stuck in this lineup, and there was, you know, she didn't have childcare because nobody wanted to come to her house to take care of the kids and whatnot. So I struck up a conversation with her, and well, I called her Lois, it's not her name, but anyways, Lois and I talked for a good 40 minutes, and she shared that she had 2 part-time jobs, she had no benefits, she had sketchy childcare, she was fighting all the time with her husband, who for some reason had some kind of a disability or was not well. She didn't explore what that was. And in that moment, oh, and she also said she worked in customer service, and so people would yell at her a lot because there were no Lysol wipes and hand sanitizer and toilet paper and all the rest of it. And so in that moment, I felt then, as I do now, that capitalism in its purest form is designed to create economic systems which lie squarely on the shoulders of the most vulnerable in society. A feminist recovery is aptly defined in the report, to which Anjum alluded earlier, understands the concept of intersectionality and also understands that everyone, including men, suffer immeasurably under the vestiges of capitalism and patriarchy. Lois, to me, is a metaphor. She symbolizes why an economic recovery is an idea whose time has come. So I have nothing intelligent to say other than to encourage folks to continue the dialogue, to honor the diversity of ideas which are needed to transform our economy. I believe we need to reach out to men and other allies in this feminist recovery strategy. And most importantly, we need not be dogmatic or arrogant in how we wish to embrace this change. We need to be open-minded to all kinds of ideas. We need to work across faith, ideology, and gender diversity and keep the dialogue going. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeanette, and a wonderful way to sum up the discussion and conversation this afternoon. And on behalf of Feminist Shift, I want to extend my very sincere thanks to all of the panelists today for such a rich conversation that I hope that we can keep going for a much longer time. For now, what I'm going to do is pass it back to Roz and Jen, because I believe that they've been monitoring the questions that have come up, and I will ask them to ask the questions of the panelists, if that's okay. So I'm not sure who is doing it, Roz or Jen, but I'll pass to one of you.
Yes, hi, Roz here. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I've been supposed to be keeping time back here, but I just keep getting so enthralled by everything you're saying. So we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A box. I'm just going to go through and pick out some. We have one here from Karen Redman. Is there any insight on why Waterloo Region is lagging behind the national stats for women returning to work? And I'll open that up to the entire panel.
I don't have a sense of the sector breakdown, but part of it could be because of the types of jobs that might be concentrated in different parts of the country. So we might be seeing different rates of recovery. And I think also, I know in the province of Ontario, and I know this will look different across the different provinces and territories, there has been a lot of anxiety around safe schools. And I know that may or may not also contribute to this as well. But I'll leave it to my fellow panelists. But these could be some of the reasons why we see disparities across the country.
I don't have the stats in front of me. I can find them. But I do know that as a municipality, we have fewer licensed childcare spots per child of childcare age than most municipalities. We are quite somewhere near the bottom, not just for Ontario, but for Canada. And I have to think that's got to be a factor.
I'm sorry, I wish I had more information on the specifics about why it's notable. It was notable. I was actually rather surprised. But I think that's part of the challenge in Waterloo, probably this idea or myth from elsewhere in Canada that, you know, it seems to be a hub and it's hugely successful local economy, but who's participating in that economy? And certainly it's true elsewhere that, you know, women's concentration in particular type of employment that's been so badly impacted, and what component that is, what's the composition of the manufacturing base here, like what types of industries. So that may well, with the lack of support services for care and the like, I think, yeah, we're seeing that everywhere. You know, it's actually, you're starting to see it up, you know, it's coming up and then it's starting to go down again. So it's something that we really have to keep an eye on. I think it's critically important to look at the employment rate particularly among women aged 25 to 54, because that's it's one of those canary in a coal mine. It's one of those sort of leading indicators around the quality of the recovery and of course, what's going to happen to people's incomes, right? Because women's earnings generally are 40% of household income on average. So that will contribute to a much slower recovery in the Waterloo region unless those types of conditions are addressed.
Thank you, everyone. Does anyone have anything else to add to that? I see Jen on the back end had added something, and it's about the kind of work women had coming into the pandemic. So a lot of part-time work in the caring sector, 25% of employed women, and 73% of all part-time jobs are filled by women in Waterloo Region. So 25% of employed women were in part-time roles, and so that would certainly, I'd imagine, contribute to that. The next question comes from Debbie Chapman. And I think I already know Jeanette's answer to this question. Thank you, Elizabeth, for touching on the affordable housing topic. And also, I love what I expect your answer to be, Jeanette, just for the record. Thank you, Elizabeth, for touching on the affordable housing topic. I'd like to hear from the panelists about their feminist analysis and proposals to solve the affordable housing crisis in the region and beyond. I invite you to think of housing as a human right and not just as a commodity. Can capitalism pull us out of this crisis? And I'll open it up to, we'll do popcorn style. Anyone who'd like to speak to it?
I can start and to say that absolutely housing is a human right. We've actually seen legislation passed federally, but has that, for something to be a right, it needs to be realized. And also when it's not realized, what are the processes for people to actually say, hey, my right is not being realized? So I know right now there's this incredible group called the Right to Housing Network that has been organizing around this. They've been calling for the need for a housing advocate and a housing council. So they can have, there can be a watchdog at the federal level to actually hold them accountable when that right is not being fulfilled. So that's something that has been being pushed forward. To make sure that there is that right that is actually honored. But in addition to that, we have called for, in the National Housing Strategy that passed in 2017, we call, YWCAs across the country called for a carve out for that plan with a gender responsive element to ensure that at least 33% of the funding that comes out of that plan is focused on gender responsive housing. So that is something we have been calling for. I feel like Elizabeth may have more to say on this as well. But for us, housing is crucial for public health, but it's also crucial for creating the building blocks of a thriving life and also a society. So for us, homelessness also looks different through a gendered lens. So we need also to have programs that address that unique need.
Debbie and I were on the same task force and had a bit of this conversation yesterday, so I know where she's coming from. My answer, quite frankly, is no. We can't rely on a profit-driven approach to dealing with affordable housing. We have lots of research into the impacts of inclusionary zoning, and this is something that the City of Kitchener is looking at right now, and I applaud them for it. It is a really important tool to make the most use of that we can. But where inclusionary zoning exists, although it does create some units of affordable housing, it doesn't lower the overall cost of housing, because for-profit developers to make some housing affordable, they have to raise the price of the other housing that they're making. So it certainly has some benefits to individuals, but in terms of the community, we need public investment in affordable housing to make it really have the sort of impact that, especially in Waterloo Region, we need it to have.
Thanks, everyone. Does anyone have anything else to add to that question?
The only thing I would add to Debbie's legitimate question is that I'd like to, at the end when she says, can capitalism pull us out of this crisis? When I saw that, I said, well, capitalism started the crisis, and so they certainly should be a player in dismantling that. But I mean, I think all of us here are realists. We're not going to dismantle capitalism by next Thursday. What I am arguing with regards to the cooperative model of economic development and co-op housing for that matter is that there are alternatives to capitalism that are working worldwide. Just because you don't learn about it in primary school, high school, or university, if you don't see it every day on TV, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You have countries like Italy, France, Belgium, Spain. There are many, many countries around the world that have utilized elements of the cooperative model of economic development in ways ways which are very meaningful, and not just through housing, but through worker co-ops, credit unions, and all the rest of it. And so I think that, I mean, I'm old enough to remember working in co-op housing in the 1990s before Mike Harris came into power. And then when Monsieur Harris came into power, he certainly put the kibosh on nonprofit and co-op housing back in the 90s. And also the federal government had done that before as well. So I think that we need to politicize this revolution to which I refer to, and quit being well-behaved feminists. I mean, you can't change society. Social movements aren't based on being polite, and social movements are based on pushing back and demanding more of our political elite. So that's how I would answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah, okay,
Yes.
I'm going to take one more. This is from an anonymous attendee. There's a huge untapped market when it comes to people with physical disabilities. This includes young professional women. As a vulnerable population, they're looking for safe and healthy social spaces during a pandemic. This summer, the city of Waterloo launched a drive-in movie event that was both inaccessible to low-income populations and disabled populations. How can we better support our cities when it comes to accessibility?
I think this really takes us back to the point that was made, I think, by all of us at some point this afternoon about the importance of having the participation of diverse voices and the leadership of diverse voices. Because I think that that's a really good example of the systemic problems that we have. I don't think anybody was sitting in a boardroom anywhere and planned for that sort of thing to happen. It just happens because there's nobody there with the lens to say, what about this? I think that this issue of disabilities is just one example, but I mean, we're certainly dealing with sort of systemic racism, other systemic issues that we're not going to be able to tackle very effectively if we don't have different eyes and different voices that are working on these issues.
It's a critical issue, as I alluded to earlier, around using this moment to hopefully push forward a much more inclusive lens on what our recovery or what the reconstruction should look like. You know, that particular example is always so graphic. We have new accessibility legislation federally, and like, what does that look like? I mean, Canada is actually quite behind, you know, decades behind where other governments or countries are in terms of accessibility and rights, and the right of people with disabilities to an accessible environment. So hopefully we'll double down. I do think the work in from the disability community has been instrumental in trying to elevate those issues during the crisis. And I think not only on the income security piece, but on the move to broaden the definition of disability for access to benefits. I think that will be a critical piece going forward. But it does hinge about making sure that people are in the room. And, you know, it's just, you know, it's too easy for people to get focused on what they consider, or the elites to think what they consider is to be important moving our recovery forward. And that will necessarily leave the large majority of us behind. So comes back to engagement in political action, certainly local, national, provincial levels.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Perfect timing. So we have 7 minutes to go. So thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to more. I'll pass it off to you, Kim, to close her out.
Right. Just again, special thanks to all the panelists for sharing their time with us and their insights this afternoon. And I think really one of the most important messages that I heard from all of you is the importance of keeping the conversation going, and the time that we have now, the openings that we have now to make the changes that need to be made to make it better for all women and the women that we serve in our organization. So thank you. Thank you to those of you that joined in this conversation today. We hope that there are ways that we can continue to engage with you and have your input as we, as a group of Feminist Shift, as the Feminist Shift, work with organizations in our community to advance the work that we're involved in, as well as the work that you're involved in. So again, thank you for joining us, and I wish you all a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you.